been driving 18-wheelers for the better part of 15 years now, and all my time on the highways and byways of this great nation of ours, I've only seen one thing that's ever really scared me. I'm not saying that I'm hardcore or something. I've had plenty of things make me anxious or nervous, and I sure do a whole lot of worrying when I'm out there in the great unknown all on my lonesome. But only one, a single solitary thing that I can safely say terrified me. I was driving through South Dakota hauling lumber down Highway 73, and out there is some of the most barren, featureless land you could ever have the misfortune of seeing. Don't get me wrong, I love this state. It's home and it'll always be my home. But sometimes you just want something to look at while you're driving, you know? Anyway, I'm driving down this particularly empty stretch of 75, a place where you can see for miles and miles in every direction, just all horizons as far as the eye can see, when suddenly, I see something on the side of the road. I couldn't tell exactly what it was until I was maybe a few hundred meters away, but it looked an awful lot like a guy crouching over something that was lying at the roadside. It looked like he was picking something up off the ground and bringing it up to his face, and it was only as I passed them that I realized what was going on. The thing that was lying on the ground was a piece of roadkill. I don't know if it was a deer or antelope or whatever you want to call it. In fact, I'm not exactly sure what kind of animal it was. I just know that the hands and face of whoever was leaning over it were covered in blood. They were eating that piece of roadkill, and it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. I just have no idea why. I've had people ask me why I didn't stop to see what the person's deal was, but I always turn the question around on them and ask if they'd want to stop their truck in the middle of nowhere to talk to someone who was eating dead animal. Apart from the occasional tough guy who lies through their teeth and claims that they'd have gotten out with a gun to play 20 questions or whatever, the answer is always the same. No. I've had a few fairly reasonable suggestions to explain what I was looking at, and some not too reasonable ones too. Some of the less believable range from Bigfoot to Wolfman to the zombie apocalypse. Some people have seen too many movies, but I actually buy one of the more legit suggestions. We have a few weirdo survivalist enclaves out here in South Dakota, one of which is the old military base turned survivalist compound in the Black Hills that they call X Point. You have to have a fair amount of scratch stashed away to buy one of those bunkers, but I've heard people really do live there. People that have half lost their minds anyways. It could have been someone like that, eating the roadkill. Someone with too much money and not enough brains who had decided to train themselves for the end of the world. But I can almost guarantee that by eating raw roadkill like that, the only thing they'd be preparing for is their own grave. I use quite a sophisticated GPS system in my truck, meaning I'm able to track and review my journeys in some pretty amazing detail. So when I had enough bars on my cell phone, I called 911 to let them know that there was some crazy person eating roadkill along 73, and passed on the rough location of where I'd spotted them. I didn't do it to be a narc or anything. I mainly did it because whoever it was obviously needed some serious help. That and the obvious danger they pose to any regular people who might be unfortunate enough to bump into them while they're in the mood to eat raw roadkill. I just can't imagine what would possess anyone to do something like that. I mean, how close to insanity or desperation do you have to be to just shovel some dead animal's raw guts into your mouth like that? I later had an uncle tell me about feral humans, like this one girl who escaped her abusive parents in the 70s, and when the authorities found her, she was growling like a dog or something. He thought maybe the guy was like that, just totally feral, and had maybe just adapted to eating raw meat like that. I'll file that one under one of the less believable explanations, and the truth is, I don't really think I want to know what was going through their head. Forgive me for commandeering someone else's story here, but I think it's very relevant to the thread, and although my father wasn't a trucker, this incident closely involves someone who was. Back in the 70s, my dad was an 18-year-old gas station attendant at a 24-hour gas station. One night, Dad was the only one working the late shift when One of the sketchiest customers he'd ever laid eyes on walks into the station. My dad said it was really obvious that the guy was concealing something in his pants, and his first thought, which brings on some major panic, is that the guy has a gun on him. Now, a whole lot of truck drivers used to use his station for two reasons. Number one, it had a pretty roomy parking lot which they'd use to take naps and breaks in, and number two, it was the only place for miles around that they could get a bite to eat. Usually, there could have been up to 10 truckers parked up in the lot, but on this particular night, there was only one truck there. Luckily, though, the guy just so happened to be in the store with my dad, but since Dad didn't know if he was armed or what kind of guy he was, he figured he was still pretty vulnerable. The weird guy starts walking up and down the rows in the store, and my dad can tell he's not really looking at anything. Most customers either come in to pay for their gas or went straight to the hot food counter to pick out something to eat. Weird guy looks like he's just biding his time before he pulls out his gun and robs the store. At least that's what's going through my dad's head. The trucker comes up to the counter while this is happening, puts down a bag of chips, and just so happens to look over his shoulder at the sketchy guy. Then, this moment of pure understanding occurs. The trucker looks at the sketchy guy, then looks at my dad, then back and forth maybe once or twice more, then asks my dad what was supposed to sound like a totally random question. He says something like, "Quiet night, huh? I wouldn't feel safe working at a gas station alone. You keep a gun behind the counter there or something?" All my dad had was a bat, and even so, it belonged to the station's owner, but the trucker widens his eyes and mimes a nod at my dad, who suddenly realizes what he's supposed to say in reply. "Oh yeah," he says. "I got a 45 right here. Always just in arms like the way." The trucker continues to play along and bangs his fist on the counter before kind of shielding the action with his body. "Oh yeah?" he says. "Well, check this out. 357 Magnum. Bought it after I saw that movie, Dirty Harry. Not as big a bullet as your 45, but it sure does pack a punch. Some days I just pray some SOB mess with me so I can blow his freaking head off." Right as he says that, the sketchy guy just makes a beeline for the door, gets back into his car, then zooms off down the highway. When the guy had left, the trucker turns back to my dad and says something along the lines of, "You know that guy was about to rob you, right? I was going to take a nap out back, but I think I'm more in the mood for coffee after that. Oh, and do yourself a favor. Call the cops." My dad says he always figured guardian angels would be all cherubic, half-naked winged ladies that descend playing harps or whatever. He didn't figure they came in the form of some hairy trucker who smelled like he hadn't showered in 3 days. But as he puts it, every day is a school day. The guy spent the entire rest of his break hanging around the store, making conversation with my dad until the cops showed up and my dad could file a report. The trucker confirmed the story too, backing my dad up when he said it looked like the sketchy guy had a gun stuffed in the back of his pants. Then get this, right in the middle of talking to the cops, both of their radios start buzzing, and they run out of the gas station, get into the patrol car, and speed off down the highway with their lights and sirens on. The trucker responds, "I hope our friend and his gun didn't find the trouble they were looking for." Only, they had. My dad said he read in the newspaper the next day that the very same guy, based on the description in the paper, had walked into another gas station about 10 miles down the highway. But unlike my dad, the clerk in that station hadn't been so lucky. The guy was the actual owner and operator of the station, tried to resist the robbery, and ended up paying with his life. From what my dad could tell, the sketchy guy pulled his gun, the station owner went for his, and the sketchy guy just pulled the trigger. Boom. Killed him behind his own counter. Now, my dad obviously didn't have a gun, but he said he was panicking just watching the guy walking around the store. If that was him getting robbed by someone with such an itchy trigger finger, he might have made a wrong move or something, and bam. I literally wouldn't even be around today to write this. I think the sketchy guy ended up getting the death penalty too. That, or died in some shootout with the cops. Maybe even the same cops who attended my dad's call. I can't quite remember which, but Dad always mentions him getting what he deserved whenever he tells the story. Now, I don't have to tell you how glad I am of that too, because even though it's so surreal to me, the idea of someone actually hurting my dad is just on a whole other kind of rage that I would feel. Dad's story doesn't just give me a belief in guardian angels, even if they do appear in unconventional forms, but it also makes me believe that there might just be something like divine justice, too. I'm not a long-haul trucker, and I don't drive an 18-wheeler, but I do drive a flatbed truck that makes deliveries around my home state of Maine. And more importantly, I definitely have a creepy story to share with you guys. This one night back in the winter of 2008, I was driving down this dark stretch of road in the late evening, and with it being winter, it was dark out. I'm driving between towns too, and some stretches of road out here barely have lights on them. I can only see what my headlights are lighting up, so imagine how scared I was when suddenly they pick up a guy just standing right in the middle of the road. I had to swerve to miss him, and I swear I only just missed the guy. Put it this way, I passed so close to him that I could tell the guy's eyes were closed as I passed him. Yeah, that close. And that wasn't the only detail I noticed about the guy. Not only was he dressed entirely in white, but he looked like he had some kind of white makeup all over his face and head too. The guy was bald, and he had this same bright white skin tone all over. The second I came to a stop, I jumped out of my truck and ran back to see if he was okay. I mean, I was still worried I might have clipped him on the way past or something, because, like I said, I must have been just inches from smashing this guy. But as I ran back just a few feet, I noticed the road was completely empty. I've had people say to me, "Oh, it's definitely a ghost." And let me tell you, it wasn't a friggin' ghost. Not that I don't believe in all that stuff, more like I heard the guy running off through a field at the side of the road. I didn't see him run, but I could 100% hear him running. I don't know what in God's name he was thinking, if it was some weird attempt at taking his own life or what, but Jesus Christ, am I glad I didn't hit him, because I think that would have messed me up for the rest of my life. Way back when I was like 8 or 9 years old, I remember talking to my dad about religion and God and stuff. At one point in the conversation, I have this really vivid memory of a question I asked and the answer he gave me. The question was something like, "Do angels really exist?" And his answer was something along the lines of this. "Before I was born, before Mom and him were even an item, my dad used to drive trucks for a living. And this is way back before labor laws were strict about brakes or mile limits, so Dad would sometimes take jobs that would require him to drive for maybe 24 or maybe 36 hours straight. So, this one particular night, after having already driven for a really long time, he noticed his eyelids getting heavier and heavier as he got sleepier and sleepier. Even worse, any attempt to wake himself up just didn't seem to be working. He chugged down the rest of his coffee, tried blasting himself with cold air from the AC, but nothing did the trick. He says he remembers passing mile marker 146, and since he had this straight stretch of road in front of him, he decided to rest his eyes and take a deep breath for maybe only 2 seconds tops. Then the next thing he knows, he feels his head do the nod jerk thing, which woke him up with a gasp. He opened his eyes to see that he was driving straight toward mile marker 158, which was right up against some ravine-type thing. If he had woken up a second later, he and his whole truck would have plummeted down the ravine, and he'd have surely been killed. But because he came to at that exact moment, he was able to safely course correct. He says if the difference between life and death came down to literally just a second, I actually wouldn't even exist right now. Once he stopped, he just pulled into the side of the road first chance he could and did the math on the whole thing. He said he must have slept through miles of driving down perfectly straight highway, doing anything between 50, only to wake up right at the moment he needed to in order to save his own skin. It was a really long-winded way of saying that he didn't actually know if angels really existed, but he sure believed they did. Either that, or there was some kind of force in the universe that woke him up just as he reached mile marker 158, right at the exact split second that he needed to. Because as I already said, if he'd nodded off a millisecond later, or nodded himself awake a millisecond later, I wouldn't be writing this right now. I just want to start off by saying what a huge fan of your channel I am. I drive trucks for a living, and most of my journeys are long haul, which means I have plenty of time to just sit in my cab doing a whole lot of nothing. As you can probably guess, it gets really, really boring. And if it wasn't for all the videos you put out, I think I'd have gone straight up crazy by now. I don't really have a lot of free time whenever I'm home, so it's taken me way longer to write this than maybe it should. But I've been meaning to share something that happened to me with you for the longest time now, and I think it'd be awesome to hear one of my own experiences on one of your videos. So, a few years ago, I was cruising west at about 70 on the I-76 just outside of Denver, Colorado. It had been a pretty boring haul up until that point. I mean, Colorado was pretty and all, but the whole drive had been completely uneventful. The weather had been great. There had been nothing to slow me down, and I was starting to think the whole ride would carry on without a hitch. But then, out of nowhere, I see this huge, almost solid cloud of dirt coming over the horizon. It had to be at least 20 to 30 feet wide, completely covering the road ahead, and it was at least as tall as my truck's cab, so maybe 12 to 15 feet tall. At first, I had no idea what I was looking at. Could have been a vehicle fire or something, but then I couldn't see the smoke billowing from anywhere, and I couldn't see any car or truck either. Then I figured it might have been like a dust storm or something, but a dust storm that's only 30 feet wide. It couldn't be. I didn't have any way of dodging it, so I just slowed down, hit the washers, then just prayed that there wasn't any rocks getting whipped up that might smash my windshield. I'm an owner and operator too, so any damage, and it's my insurance, not some company's. Seconds later, wham! I hit it, and the noise in my cab was seriously loud. That's what set it apart from a regular dust storm. They just don't make that kind of noise. Then the second thing that set it apart from a dust storm was the mess it left on my windshield. Because as I hit the mass of it, whatever it was, everything that hit my windshield left a smear of what looked like some kind of juice on the glass. That's when I worked out what I was driving into. It was bees. All these freaking huge bees that seriously sounded like rocks when they were slamming into my cab. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I mean, I'd seen giant swarms of locusts on TV before, but bees, I didn't think they even swarmed like that. Two things really creeped me out about the whole thing, and not so much all the bee guts on my windshield either, because I'm not a particularly squeamish person. The first thing was how, if I'd have just been walking at the side of the road, those things might have actually killed me. A couple of hundred bee stings could easily kill a person, so I've read anyway, and if they're aggressive when they're in that swarming state, that'd have been the end of me. But then the second thing, and the thing that stuck with me long after I passed through the swarm, was the idea that they'd been flying like that to avoid some epic natural disaster or something. And for the next few miles, I found myself getting really anxious, half expecting to feel an earthquake or see a meteor falling from the sky or something. Obviously, nothing like that happened, thank God, but the first chance I could, I looked up giant bee swarms on Google to see if they were actually a thing. Obviously they are, but ones that size are an extremely rare event. When I told another trucker about the whole thing recently, he told me I was lucky to see something like that, like it was some kind of natural wonder or something. But let me tell you, I didn't feel so lucky to be driving through it at the time. I was driving my 18-wheeler on this long-haul stretch one time when I suddenly needed to pee real bad. I figured I'd just wait for a gas station or something, but after maybe 5 or 10 minutes of driving, there was no sign of any, and no signs to tell me if I was close to one or not. So, to save from soaking my drawers, I decided to pull over and take a leak at the side of the road. It was incredibly dark outside, and although the side of the road I stopped on had a bunch of woods in it, I'll admit it was way too spooky for me to just wander off into the dark. And being as dark as it was, I figured I'd be able to just put my hazard lights on and take a few steps to the side before whipping it out. Then right as I'm peeing, I hear something running through the trees toward me. I mean, whatever it was pounding dirt as it came at me. I couldn't see a freaking thing, and it scared the life out of me even more, so I tried to stop peeing and put my junk away, then just bolted back to my truck cab as quickly as I could. I half expected whatever it was to slam itself up against the door of my truck, and since I keep a gun in my glove box, first thing I did was grab it, and then aim it right towards the window, getting ready to blast the first thing I saw. It felt like I was lying there on the seat for like a half an hour, but in reality it was maybe only a minute or two, and absolutely nothing appeared at the window or banged up against the door of my truck. I know it was dumb of me, but I spent the next few minutes looking out of the driver's side window checking for whatever it was I heard running, but again, I didn't see anything. That was about the same time I realized that I hadn't actually stopped peeing when I thought I did, and in the process of putting it away and diving into my truck, I soaked the entirety of my pants and seat. I spent the next few miles driving back buck naked from the waist down, with my pants slung over the air conditioner trying to dry them before the next rest stop. Definitely one of my worst nights ever on the job, and for more than one reason, too. So this might not be the most terrifying story y'all have ever heard, but I'm pretty sure you'll understand why I found this so creepy. I drive trucks for a living, and this one morning I'm cruising down this stretch of highway during the summer. It was early enough for the sun to be up and incredibly bright, and when I come around this one bend in the road, all I see in front of me, on the blacktop, was blood. Blood, guts, crushed bones, and fur. I mean, it was a massacre out there. There must have been like 100 small animals bleeding all over the road for maybe a quarter mile. And I ain't never seen anything like that in my life. Looked like the set of a horror movie or something. Later I found out that some science place had been raided by animal rights protesters or something, who let out all these minks or ferrets or whatever in the middle of the night. The poor things booked it through a forest, across a field, and then onto a busy stretch of highway. Boom, boom, boom. They're running back and forth, getting crushed by cars. Must have been a few of them coming thick and fast, because I can't see how they got so many at one time before all of them things just scattered and got their butts off the road. But good God, I suppose the road to hell really is paved with good intentions. From 1975 to 1990, the American Southlands were stalked by one of the most abhorrent and vicious killers the country has ever known. He is thought to have tortured, violated, and murdered more than 50 different women and girls during his grotesque 15-year spree. And while many other killers would have been apprehended long before they reached such body count, the secret to this killer's success was his mobility. You see, not only was he constantly on the move using his 16-wheeler truck, but he also converted his soundproofed sleeper cab into a veritable torture chamber. This is the story of Robert Ben Rhodes, perhaps better known as the Truck Stop Killer. Born on November 22nd of 1945 in Council Bluffs, Iowa, Rhodes's formative years set him apart from most serial killers due to their relative normalcy. Although his father was a serving soldier in West Germany until his elementary school years, Rhodes's childhood seems to be objectively stable and wholesome. He was never abused, he never acted out, and by his teenage years, whatever trouble he got into is generally characteristic of a regular angsty teen. He was active and outgoing during his high school years, taking part in sports such as football and wrestling. He even regularly attended the Thomas Jefferson High School French Club and was apparently a rather proficient francophone. The aforementioned trouble involved juvenile arrest for public fighting and vehicle tampering, but I'm sure we can all agree that very few young men make it through their teenage years without getting into the occasional scuffle. It seems that darkness only entered Rhodes's life in 1964, the same year he enlisted in the U.S. Marines. It was around this time that his father was suddenly arrested by Council Bluffs police, and the local community was stunned when they learned it was on charges of inappropriately touching a 12-year-old girl. Then, just when it seemed that the situation couldn't get any worse, Rhodes's father took his own life before he could be tried. Following his father doing so, Rhodes entered something of a downward spiral, and his military conduct worsened to the point where in 1968, he was dishonorably discharged from the military for his involvement in a violent robbery. During the years that followed, Rhodes's existence was marred by his inability to settle into any kind of routine lifestyle. He briefly attended college but quickly dropped out. He then applied to join the Council Bluffs police force but had his application rejected due to his dishonorable discharge from the military. He subsequently found work in a variety of stores, supermarkets, warehouses, and restaurants, marrying and divorcing 3 different women in the process. One of these women, Deborah, recalls that Rhodes became horribly abusive once the flame of their romance burned out, and she found herself constantly rebuffing his attempts to introduce sadistic and masochistic activities to their relationship. Eventually, Rhodes found a form of employment that he could finally settle on, one that would take him far away from Iowa, all the pain, torment, and shame, and of his father's despicable inclinations: long-haul trucking. Rhodes later stated that he had been preying on hitchhikers and truck stop escorts since the mid-1970s, but due to his mobility, he didn't come to the attention of authorities until 1990. It was in January of that year that Rhodes happened across a husband and wife hitchhiker couple named Patricia Walsh and Douglas Sikowski. Patricia and Douglas had been hitchhiking across the state of Texas and, by all accounts, had experienced a pleasant journey thus far. They had no reason to be suspicious of Rhodes, who seemed perfectly affable when he first stopped to pick them up. Yet shortly after they continued along the highway, the couple's nightmare began in earnest. It's not clear how Douglas was murdered, but when his body was found in Texas's Sutton County, it would not be positively identified until 2 years later. In the week that followed her husband's murder, Patricia Walsh was kept alive for 7 long days before she was finally killed. In that time, police suspect she was essentially used as a pleasure slave, kept bound and gagged in Rhodes's soundproof sleeper cab, and repeatedly tortured until he grew bored of her. Her body was then dumped in Millard County, Utah, and by the time her body found its way onto a coroner's table, she was barely recognizable. A month later, Rhodes snatched 18-year-old Shauna Holtz from the side of the highway, bundling her into his makeshift torture chamber, where she was tortured and kept prisoner for around 2 weeks. Miraculously, Shayna managed to escape captivity and immediately rushed to inform law enforcement of her harrowing ordeal. She gave the police a detailed description of both Rhodes and the truck he was driving, and this led to the speedy detention of her attacker. However, when faced with actually pressing charges against Rhodes, Shayna suddenly began to have second thoughts. She told investigating police officers that she didn't think a jury would believe her story, and even when assured that the mountain of evidence would ensure a conviction, she refused to appear in court. "I don't see any good in filing charges," she said on record. "It's just going to be my word against his. If there was any evidence, I would file charges and sue him." Shayna was once again shown the massive amounts of collated evidence and was told not a jury in the land would decline to convict Rhodes of his heinous and brutal actions, but still, she declined a court appearance. It's now believed that Shayna found the combination of fear and trauma to be completely and utterly psychologically overwhelming. She may have believed that if cleared of the charges, that Rhodes would hunt her down to subject her to more of the same awful treatment. And if he did, she might not be fortunate enough to escape for a second time. 2 weeks after the kidnapping charges against Rhodes were dropped, two teenage runaways named Ricky Lee Jones and Regina K. Walters were attempting to hitchhike out of the Houston suburb of Pasadena. Rhodes spotted them, put on his facade of friendliness, and as the young couple climbed into the cab of his truck, their fate was sealed. Just like with Patricia Walsh and Douglas Sikowski, Ricky Lee Jones was murdered almost straight away, with his body being found on March 3rd of 1991 in Lamar County, Mississippi, whereas Walters was told she'd suffer the same fate unless she complied. The kidnapping of Regina K is perhaps the most viscerally disturbing of Rhodes's murders, because in this case, there exists actual photographical evidence of his victim's final moments. The police would later seize photographs from Rhodes's home that depicted Regina Walters and other victims being forced to stand and sit in painful stress positions. These photographs are extremely disturbing as the horror etched into their faces is palpable. In Regina's case, the images show her having differing hair lengths with a variety of different bruises, suggesting that she had been held captive for a very long time, possibly even months. In addition to physical abuse and psychological torture Regina was subjected to, Robert Ben Rhodes chose to cruelly taunt Regina's father in a series of anonymous phone calls. In the months after he kidnapped her, Rhodes would call his home or office and say things like, "I made some changes. I cut her hair." During one phone call, Regina's father asked Rhodes to at least tell him if his daughter was alive or not. Rhodes reportedly responded with, "Oh, she's alive all right. I've left her hung up in a barn somewhere, but you'll never find her." It was a lie. By the time the phone call was made, Regina was dead, killed in a manner which is almost too sickening to recount. On the day of her execution, Regina was taken to a derelict piece of farmland where there existed a rotting, dilapidated shack. Rhodes had cut her long, flowing curls short, forced her into a long black dress and heels, then told her to pose as if he was about to attack her. The photos Ben Rhodes took of her that day are easy to find online, and it's possible that she was assured that she would be safe if she only complied with the request. It was a lie. Once Rhodes had finished taking photographs of Regina in her meek and awkward poses, he wrapped a piece of metal wire around her neck, then strangled the life out of her. Thankfully, Rhodes would be apprehended a short while later, denying him the chance to kill again. But it was undeniably a frighteningly close call for his latest prospective victim. On the early morning of April 1st, 1990, Arizona Highway Patrol Trooper Mike Miller discovered a truck with its hazard lights on at the side of the interstate. Deciding to stop to see if the driver needed any assistance, Miller parked his patrol car at the edge of the road, then got out to investigate. When he drew level with the truck's sleeper cab, he heard a faint sound coming from inside. Then when he opened the small hatch, he was greeted by an ear-splitting scream. Inside was a naked and bloodied Kathleen Vine, whose arms were restrained by a pair of handcuffs which had been grafted to the ceiling of the sleeper cab. When Rhodes emerged from the driver's seat of the truck, he told the horrified trooper Miller that he had simply found Kathleen at the side of the highway like that and was in the process of seeking help for her. Thankfully, Miller didn't buy Rhodes' ruse, and the officer drew his gun on him, disarming and arresting him in the process. It was only when Rhodes was in police custody that a homicide detective was able to connect him to a string of disappearances across America's southern states. And not long after, a charge of murder was added to an already extensive list of offenses, including aggravated assault and unlawful imprisonment. It wasn't until 1994 that Rhodes was convicted of the murder of Regina K. Walters, and as punishment, he was sentenced to life without parole at Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. Just over a decade later, he was extradited to Utah to be tried for the deaths of Candace Walsh and Douglas Sikowski, but charges were dropped after the families of the victims claimed that testifying in court would be far too painful to bear. They were reassured that Rhodes was about to be extradited to Texas to be tried for the murder of Ricky Lee Jones, and in this case, Rhodes pleaded guilty to his death in exchange for a second life sentence, ensuring he would never again see the light of day. Rhodes is now 76 years old and is still detained at the Menard Maximum Security Prison. But although he has previously claimed as many as 50 victims, authorities have said it's unlikely he'll ever stand trial again. That means it's impossible to know just how many missing people Rhodes is responsible for, and that there are scores of family across Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Utah who will never truly know what happened to their loved ones. It's also not entirely clear why Rhodes chose to kill in the first place. Perhaps it all stems from the anger and shame he felt regarding his father's deviance and eventually him taking his own life, that killing the innocent was his way of getting back at the world that he felt had wronged him while he was still in the prime of his life. The only thing we know for certain is that Rhodes was imbued with a rare, distilled variety of evil that led him not only to torture those he would go on to kill, but also to reach out and torture their families as well. It was a foggy Saturday night on July 25th of 1953 when 30-year-old interstate trucker Lester Woodward pulled into an unlit gravel parking lot to get a few hours of sleep. It was something Woodward had done 100 times before as he drove along the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and common practice among long-haul truckers to lessen their exhaustion and lower the chances of serious traffic accidents. The next morning, a fellow trucker found himself lost on the same stretch of highway, and upon seeing Woodward's truck still parked in the same secluded spot, he decided to pull in to ask directions. When he drew level with Woodward's cab, he saw the man slumped against the dashboard and called out to stir him from his slumber. Woodward didn't respond, and that's when the lost trucker noticed the single bullet hole near the man's hairline. Woodward had been executed with a single bullet, fired from a .32 caliber revolver. Police speculated the killer had quietly pulled his own vehicle into the secluded parking lot before stealthily mounting the truck's cab to fire the fatal shot. They also suspected that his speedy getaway had caused a 6-car pileup nearby, one of which had caused several others to lose their lives that night. Since Woodward's wallet was completely empty, police suspected that the murder was little more than a violent robbery. But just 3 days later, the shooting of another trucker would suggest that the killer's motive was considerably more sinister. 30 miles east of the spot Lester Woodward was murdered, 39-year-old Harry Pitts took a break from making stops for the Baker Drive-Away Company when he pulled into a similarly isolated parking lot to catch some shut-eye. The following morning, a coworker of Pitts spotted his rig sitting idle in the lot and pulled up alongside him to shoot the breeze. The sight that greeted him was truly horrifying. While he slumbered, Pitt had been shot through the mouth, leaving a gruesome gaping wound in his cheek. The bullet had then ripped through his neck, severing his spinal cord and killing him instantly. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the bullet was a .32 caliber round fired by the same revolver that had killed Lester Woodward. Tire tracks suggested that following Pitt's execution, the killer had screeched away from the scene of the crime, much in the same manner as he had the previous one. However, in this case, there was no signs of robbery, as all of Pitt's valuables were left on his person. This was down to one of two possibilities. Either the killer had been interrupted while rifling through Pitt's pockets to retrieve his wallet, or robbery was never his intention in the first place. The latter left police with a horrifying prospect, and when no witnesses came forward to confirm they'd stumbled across the crime scene, it was all but confirmed. When news of the killings reached the ears of truckers in the region, it terrified them. The idea that such a monster would randomly target them while they were at their most vulnerable was almost too much to bear, and truckers began taking certain precautions in order to remain safe. They armed themselves with firearms and melee weapons, and began traveling in pairs or in whole convoys to deter any potential attackers. When the time came to sleep, terrified truckers piled into the parking lots of diners or service stations, and although many a joke was made regarding their circling of the wagons, the fear among them was deadly serious. Some refused to believe that something so horrifying was occurring, and suggested the victims were deliberately targeted. "I think it's a guy with a grudge," one told a reporter. "Maybe he got the wrong guy the first time and then went back to get the right one the second time. I just can't make any sense that he'd go around shooting just anybody." Yet the very next day, law enforcement announced a very different theory. "There is a maniac loose on the turnpike," said one homicide detective, following the shooting of yet another trucker in Ohio. Terror gripped the turnpike, and an increased number of highway patrol officers kept watch along the roads. They were tasked with waking all lone slumbering drivers, sometimes telling them to move along, other times just to make sure that they'd not been executed. As expected, the media jumped on the story, capitalizing on the mortal fears of truckers everywhere as they dubbed the mysterious killer the Turnpike Phantom. Victim number 3 was 36-year-old John Shepard, and just like the other victims, he was shot dead in the cab of his truck as he slept by the roadside. Yet miraculously, Shepard survived the attack and would later participate in a press interview from the hospital bed he was recovering in. "A noise like a firecracker went off in my head, and I reared up and yelled for my mother. I thought I was at home," he told reporters. Somehow the bullet intended to kill him had merely shattered his jaw. Then as he attempted to stem the bleeding, he heard a high-pitched male voice call out to him from outside. "I'm out of gas, I need money," the voice said. At the time, Shepard didn't even realize he'd been shot and assumed that he'd been hit with something in the course of being robbed. He handed over his wallet and his watch, then heard the assailant speed off in his car. After the bullet was removed from Shepard's jaw, ballistic analysts determined it had been fired from the same weapon that killed Woodward and Pitts. The Turnpike Phantom had struck again. Determined to catch their culprit, law enforcement threw the book at just about anyone who drew suspicion. They tried to pin the murders on recently married couple who had financed their cross-country honeymoon by robbing truckers, but the case fell apart. Then there was the businessman with the .22 caliber automatic in his trunk, but the caliber didn't match the one used in the murders. 3 Florida gangsters were then arrested on suspicion of the killings, but each had an alibi covering the nights in question. Following the arrest, several terrified truck drivers reported being followed by a man in a car, but each time the police rushed to the scene, they discovered the man had vanished. However, it's not clear if there really was anyone following the drivers, as it may have been the case that a deep paranoia had set in among the region's truckers. During the month that followed, and despite the many roadblocks set up by various highway patrol units, little progress was made on the case. The Pennsylvania Truck Motor Association even offered today's equivalent of $118,000 in reward money for any information leading to the Phantom's capture, but the bounty failed to generate a single usable lead. It wasn't until early October of 1953 that there was a serious break in the case, and it came in the form of John Shepard's stolen watch showing up in a Cleveland pawn shop. The owner of the shop had been given a detailed description of the item and immediately contacted police when he determined it was the same piece. Luckily, the man who pawned it had been foolish enough to give the shop owner his real name, and it wasn't long before the man was traced to a rooming house in the very same town he'd pawned the watch. When the police arrived at the rooming house and demanded to be shown the room of one John Wesley Wable, they were told he had vanished. However, John had left behind a 22-year-old girlfriend, Leora Chrissy, who told police she'd been given a very unusual going-away present, a .32 caliber revolver. It was the exact same revolver that had been used in the truck ambushes. After doing some research into Wable's background, police discovered he was an unemployed factory worker who had been fired from his job back in March. Despite Wable having no history of violent crime, they were frustrated to learn that he had been arrested on August 6th, mere miles from the scene of Woodward's murder, for failing to return a rental car on time. The cops actually had him in custody until September 23rd, when Wable's father settled the claim with the car dealer, convincing him to drop the case in the process. Their frustration doubled when they discovered that, while being held in the county jail, Wable had actually admitted to being the Turnpike Phantom. Yet his confession was dismissed by skeptical jailers who viewed it as nothing but a baseless attempt to gain clout, and he was subsequently set free. October 9th of 1953 saw a nationwide manhunt for Wable begin. The following day, a New Mexico State patrolman spotted a stolen car near Isleta, a small town just 10 miles south of Albuquerque. Inside it were 3 men, each wanted in connection with the robbery of an Albuquerque gas station, and one of these men happened to be John Wesley Wable. With the police in hot pursuit, Wable and his 2 sidekicks raced off at speeds exceeding 100 miles an hour, crashing through 2 police roadblocks in the process. By the time police caught up with the car, Wable had fled on foot. A short time later, an off-duty nurse named Carolyn Smith spotted a hitchhiker walking toward a local homeless camp near the Santa Fe railroad track. By that point, Wable had garnered nationwide notoriety for his crimes, and many were familiar with his physical description. Smith also noted that the man seemed extremely agitated, and on a hunch, she reported the sighting to local police. Upon his arrest, Wable insisted that he was completely innocent of the murders. He admitted to being the owner of the murder weapon, but claimed that a friend of his named Jim Parks had borrowed the gun just a week before the killing began. There was no evidence that such a man even existed, but Wable insisted on sticking to his story throughout his short trial. However, he did end up admitting to being at the scene of John Shepard's shooting, but said it was Parks who had shot the man before stealing his watch. Wable's father swore that his son was tucked in bed at the time of the murders, but the prosecution's arguments were strong to say the least. Then, after just 4 hours of jury deliberation, their verdict was read before the court. Guilty, they said. First degree, recommended sentence, death penalty. Wable had been condemned to ride the lightning. On September 26th of 1955, John Wesley Wable was executed via the electric chair. The man was gone, but his legacy remained. Wable's terrifying murder spree forever changed the habits of long-haul truckers everywhere, and since then, truck drivers have congregated en masse at crowded, well-lit rest stops in order to get their much-needed sleep. A trucker might not believe in ghosts or spirits, but there's no denying that they're haunted by the frightening memory of John Wesley Wable. Some serial killers are caught entirely by accident, some after long and tiresome investigations. Yet there is a special breed of multiple murderers whose careers creating cadavers comes to an end when they hand themselves into the police, and one of those is Wayne Adam Ford. Born on December 3rd of 1961, Ford was born the second son of an American father and German mother in Petaluma, California. Ford's personal problems began when he was just 10 years old, with his parents' messy divorce having a deeply adverse psychological effect on him. After just a few years of high school, Ford dropped out and enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he served for 6 years before receiving an honorable discharge in 1985. It was an amicable split, as increasing psychological decline necessitated several stints in psychiatric hospitals. He grew to hate the Marine lifestyle, and the Corps had no interest in holding on to someone with increasingly dangerous deviancies. Ford went through 2 marriages, both of which ended in divorce, and like many others who failed to settle into any kind of set routine or lifestyle, he became a long-haul trucker to make ends meet. It was during his career as a trucker that he began to have scrapes with the law, but nothing ever seemed to stick. In just a few years, Ford was accused of beating and robbing an escort and several other incidents of vicious violence and animal cruelty. But no one could have suspected just how evil and deranged he truly was. Finally, on November 3rd of 1998, Ford walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff Department in Eureka, California, and told the deputy on the front desk that they needed to arrest him. When asked why they needed to arrest him, Ford simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a Ziploc bag containing the severed breast of one of his victims. He then told a gathering of horrified deputies that he had murdered 4 women between October of 1997 and November of 1998. Following this confession, he was swiftly arrested and detained. For some reason, Even with Ford's detailed confession, it took until June of 2006 to find him guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. His haunting handiwork was so utterly harrowing that, even with a guilty plea, Ford was sentenced to death for his crimes. He's currently on the death row of California's San Quentin State Prison, but thanks to the moratorium on executions in California, he is unlikely to go the way of his victims anytime soon. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, why do cows be so jacked?
The story I'm about to tell you guys has never been discussed outside of my immediate family. All of this took place in a matter of minutes. I'm going to go into exact details so that you guys can decide for yourself what really happened that night, because I don't know what to think. So 2002, New England. I'm finally settled into bed. I fall asleep the moment that my head hit the pillow. I was catching an early night in the AM for business, and suddenly I hear my 8-year-old son Russell running down the hall, rounding the corner that enters our bedroom. All I can think to myself is, not tonight, Russ. But it's like he has a built-in alarm system that goes off every time that I have a business trip. But Russ and I are no stranger to this drill. He always stands a few feet from my side of the bed and whispers, "I don't feel good." He doesn't want to wake his dad, who has to see patients in the morning, and is quick to debunk Russ's plan to stay home from school. Exhausted, I go into mum mode and recite the ailment list. "Okay, Russell, is it your head? It's your tummy. Are you hot? Are you cold?" No answer. I force myself to sit up now. I glance at my alarm. It's like 3:40 a.m. I don't turn on the light, although in reality my husband could sleep through a tornado. "Russell, you need to answer me. What hurts?" No answer. "Okay, Russ, come with me. I'll take you back to bed." I reach for my glasses on the nightstand. I put my hand out to Russ, and now seeing his small outline in the dark. Only something isn't right. Although my room is dark, the child in front of me was so much darker than the actual room. He is the same height as Russell. He's wearing the same red shorts and t-shirt that I helped Russ into at bedtime. But never have I seen a child so severely emaciated. His arms and legs look like thin spindles. He has no hair. I can't turn away from his hollowed-out eyes, and he seems to be looking nowhere. His mouth is quite full, almost too large for his thin face, with corners that turn up, creating a sort of strange forced smile. The high bridge of his nose reminded me of the profiles that you see in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and he looks as though he may be sleepwalking or lost. I'm deeply confused. Is this a friend Russell took home, or a child who somehow wandered into our home? Deeply confused. Is this a friend Russell took home, or a child who somehow wandered into our home? Keeping my eyes on him, I try to reach for my husband. I need to shake him awake, but he's at the very edge of our king-size bed, and I can't reach him without moving completely from my spot. And I can't bring myself to move an inch. So I call out to my husband. "Michael, wake up. Please, wake up. Somebody's in our house." He continues snoring. The child is perfectly still, and now looking directly at me. I lean forward to examine him more closely, and to my horror, I realize that this is not a child. Rocking side to side now on its thin feet, I can see that it's grinning. It kept making a sort of guttural sound followed by a child's soft cry that sounded exactly like Russell's, yet its mouth never opened. Quickly tilting its head to one side as if trying to ask me a question, a low humming begins like the sound of a TV, and I'm trembling, but my rational brain tells me that this has to be a dream, a lucid dream. But how can I be dreaming if I'm sitting up like this? I can read the time on my clock. I see my nightstand, my bureau. I touch my face, my hands. I touch my eyes. They're definitely open. I now have no doubt that I'm awake, and the figure instantly starts to move again, stepping closer in a quick disjointed movement, as if it has a sort of severe curvature of the spine. It's too much for my brain to acknowledge. I've never been this frightened in my life, but I feel like I have to remain strong. I need to figure out what's going on here. It's slowly moving backwards in the exact way that it moved forwards, but about 2 yards away now. I call out for Michael once more. He mumbles, but still in a deep sleep. And then, all of a sudden, the figure starts to dissipate, dissolving quickly into a sort of smoke that resembled a spider's web, spinning rapidly into one large smoke sculpture, forming into what looks like a hideous head of a creature. I would describe it as a dragon's head if I had to, that I had frequently seen in Asian architecture, but the low buzzing just became louder. The creature is looking directly at me now. I only remember its amber eyes that were sort of long, narrow slits, and then it charges directly at me as fast as lightning, and it hits my chest. I'm then knocked flat on my back, rendering me breathless. Screaming at the top of my lungs now, I finally woke Michael, who jumped out of bed and turned the lights on. Russell came running in too, asking what the heck that us two were screaming about. I'm trying to sleep in case you forgot too, but Michael immediately understood that I was distraught. He picked up Russell, putting him at ease. "Mummy just had a bad dream," he said. "You know what that's like, Russ, don't you?" He put Russ back to bed and joked about Mummy being a big crybaby, and I heard Russell laughing and knew that he would be okay. Although I was pretty horrified that I had woken up my family like this in this disturbing way. Michael rushed back in quickly and closed our bedroom door. "Calm down, Marla. You're hysterical." I was completely filled with dread. "Michael, something was really in our room. I thought it was Russell, but it was something horrible. Not human. Marla, it was a bad dream, all right? I told you it was too soon to return to work. The effects of meningitis don't vanish overnight, you know. Many patients recovering have terrible hallucinations, especially creative people like you. Think of it as your brain rewiring, healing itself. Michael, I know you don't believe this, but I'm telling you, something physically knocked me down. I've never felt this way before in my entire life. Please, Michael, I wasn't dreaming. I need you to believe me." Michael returned soon and handed me a mild sedative. "Take another big sip of water, Marla. You're going to cancel your business trip, all right? It's obvious that you're too stressed. Your work can wait. All that really matters right now is that you're okay. Remember, you're Russell's mother and he's our first priority, right? You're his safe place and you can't continue to scare him with all of this. Russell was so upset while you're in the hospital. Please, let's not add to it, all right? I love you, Marla, and I promise that you'll be just fine. It's the healing process of your brain, all right? You definitely experienced a hallucination, and it's an unusual sleep disorder, but it happens. And look, I understand that it was frightening. It probably felt very real, but it was just a dream. Why don't you take Russell to the beach tomorrow and enjoy yourself and have some fun?" He kisses me and tucks me in, and I just can't shake the dread, the fear, and my heart was physically hurting at this point. I can't stop the tears. I know Michael is right. He's always been my voice of reason. No malice, no dishonesty. It's simply his need to fix things, to find solutions. It's just how he's wired, and in fact, it's why I love him. I would be lying if I said that my life didn't change that night. And my belief system, I fear, will never be the same again. after that. When I was about 9 years old, I lived in a 1930s built-in apartment flat. I had lived there since I was a baby with my mum, dad, and disabled little brother. My bedroom in the house was down a long corridor that had no windows, so it was always a bit dark. As a child, I was always very scared of being alone in that corridor and would run the length as quickly as possible to get to the front room and what I felt was safety. Around the age of 9, I was getting a lot of pushing from my parents to go to bed on my own as, until this point, my dad would lay with me until I fell asleep and then would leave. About the time I started to go to sleep on my own too, I started to have reoccurring dreams about waking up in the night with an old man with no arms and legs hovering above the bottom of my bed. I never told anyone and would instead creep into the kitchen with my blanket and pillow and sleep there till morning. I did this to avoid the old man. Now, every morning my parents would find me and tell me off for sleeping in the kitchen, but I refused to speak to anyone about my reasons. I continued to experience the same nightly encounter with the old man with no arms or legs, and over time I started to make out more and more about him and his features. This man looked to be in his 60s. He looked round and sort of plump. His bald head had age spots and moles on it. The man never talked, but always just sort of looked at me without blinking. After multiple encounters, I could see that the man's arms and legs were stumps rounded, and the ends were as if they had been taken from him a long time ago. One of the strangest things about the whole experience, though, was the sort of damp smell that I would get in my house when he would appear. Anyway, a year and a bit of almost nightly encounters would start to gradually become once in a week and then once a month until it was once every so often with no frequency. I turned 13 on the day that we moved house and never had that experience again, but sometimes recalled it. Over time, the memory faded until years later, and me being 26 and my daughter now 2, I went to my mum's house, as I do every Sunday. I got to talking about sleepless nights with my daughter, and my mum recalled the memories of me sleeping on the kitchen floor. I decided to explain, too, that I was having dreams about this old man with no arms and legs for the first time, and my mum, her face dropped as I recalled my experiences with this old man. I first thought that this look was due to finally understanding her son's childhood distress, but I was wrong. Really wrong, in fact. You see, my mum explained that the previous tenant was in fact an old man who had his arms and legs taken due to infections from diabetes. My mum had lived her whole life in that area and seen this man lots of times too. And from my description, my mum said that I had described the very same thing. I was horrified to say the least, but my mum continued and said that sometimes in the night she would wake up to a sort of old smell that she could only smell at night and would be gone in the morning. My mum put the smell down at the time to drains and other explainable things. She also explained how she would come into my room in the morning to find things moved around, but put this down to restless sleeping children playing with toys. I can tell you, though, that I never played with toys at night. I always pulled my cover over my head and made a breathe hole and just waited to be scared, tired, and alone for that old man to come my way. This happened in my hometown when I was 7 and I'm female, 36 now. For context, I lived off of an island off the coast of Washington state in a military town that is among one of the safest places to live in all of the US. But, as you guys are probably all aware, weirdos are everywhere. The timing is vague for me, but since I was outside playing with my friends, it's likely that it was a summer evening just before dinner time. We were screwing around, riding our bikes in the street, just running around, the usual kid stuff, when a car pulled up and stopped in the middle of the street. I don't remember exactly what the man driving it said, but he must have beckoned me over there because I know that I walked close enough to hear him. He asked me if I'd seen any other kids wandering around, because his were missing. I noticed then that there was also a woman in the car with him, so I assumed that she was the mum and he must have been the dad. I said no, that I hadn't seen any kids wandering around, but that there was a park nearby around the corner and you might be able to find them there. No, too, that I was super proud of myself for thinking of this at 7. The man then asked if I'd be willing to get into the car and show them where the park is. Although I didn't understand just how dangerous this was, I was well aware of the whole stranger danger thing, so I said no. He asked again if I could please get into the car and help him find his children at the park, and I said no, sorry, I can't do that, but I gave him directions to the park, and then I skipped off to continue playing with my friends, who were standing there just watching the whole time. And after that, he drove away. A few minutes later, my mum came outside to call me in for dinner, and I bounced happily up the driveway to tell her how I'd helped someone. I was very excited at the time to have done this for an adult, which will bring me to my final part at the end of this. And then I explained the whole thing to her. Her face changed a bit, but she just nervously said, "That's very nice of you, hun." And I felt a surge of pride. And then my dad came home. Solid Navy dude, black belt, used to be in the para-rescue, and so badass that Chuck Norris checks under his bed for my dad every night. And my mum obviously told him what happened. And his reaction was much, much different. He told me that, although he was proud that I liked to help people, that I was never, ever to approach anyone that I didn't know like that again. He said, and I'll never forget this, and have since passed this wisdom on to my daughter, remember, adults should never be asking children for help like that. He told me that I was lucky and that I hadn't got snatched, and to always remember it because they would have lost me forever if things had gone badly. He was very stern, which hurt my little ego, and I lost a tiny bit of innocence that day. And now that I had 30 years of knowing my dad, he was only stern because that's his reaction, and also anger, when he gets scared. And I mean, the poor dude, before that I had escaped as a toddler and was found on a cliff in Japan, and then I left the yard another time in San Antonio to sell my coloring book pages door to door, and I'm sure that he was wondering what fresh hell he was in for this time with a child like me. To wrap it up though, I don't remember if my parents did anything with what I had told them, but it's almost 100% likely that they did because they're pretty solid, loving folks. To my knowledge, however, nothing ever really came of it, and I never heard about any instances like that again. I've decided to tell this story today because I know a lot of people have had similar experiences with weird or creepy host families, and know just how uncomfortable and awkward it is. This is a tad bit lengthy, but here it goes. So basically, some of my classmates in high school and I, along with some teachers, we went on a month-long trip around Europe to study, and as we only spent 1 week in each city, we stayed with host families for the most part. The trip had been going amazing too. My friend and I, who had chosen to stay together in our accommodation, had had a really good experience with an old lady that we stayed with the first part of the trip, so we were really excited to meet our next hosts. We had been encouraged to write an email to each of our hosts a week before we left home, just so that they could get to know us and we could get to know them, which helped making our first interactions not as awkward. However, I had sent a really nice email to the father of this family, his name is John, and he just never really replied. I didn't think much of it. He probably hadn't seen it, or maybe he just didn't want to answer, which is totally valid, I suppose. But just when we got off the plane, I got an email from him which merely said, "Hello, let me know when you get on the bus." I thought it was a bit cold, but I do tend to be a bit overly friendly sometimes, as a result of being extremely socially awkward, so I figured it was probably just me being too intense or something. The cab took us to their house, and we were greeted with the strongest glare that I had ever experienced. Again, me being overly friendly, I just sort of kept saying hi, and thanking him for everything and whatnot, but he didn't even say anything. He just kept glaring at us, and then at the taxi driver until the cab left, and he just opened the door and let us inside. Before he even said hi or even showed us around the house or anything, he made us stay in the narrow entrance and began telling us the rules of the house, which is normal, I suppose. but the way that he said it was very intimidating, basically stating that we had to take extreme care of his house or we'd have to pay for anything and everything that we damaged, which, again, valid I suppose, but he didn't stop glaring at us like we had already broken something. He ordered us to take our shoes off and told us our room was on the 3rd floor, then he left, and so we had to carry our suitcases up the very, very tiny and narrow stairs, not even knowing where we were going because we obviously didn't know the house and he hadn't even showed us the way, but whatever, we thought. It's probably just the awkward introduction. But the awkwardness had only just started, to be honest. You see, we were called down for dinner and we sat waiting whilst he cooked for us and his daughters. He asked us which one of us was vegetarian. That's me. And after explaining how stupid and unhealthy I was for not eating meat, and how being a vegetarian would take 10 years off your life, he handed me a little bowl of literally 5 pieces of very small lettuce leaves. Again, kind of awkward, I know, but we wouldn't even have dinner at their house since the school that we were exchanging into covered our meals, something I'm still so glad about too. So, in the end it was fine. He started asking some really specific private questions though, like, how much money have you brought? Where do you keep it so you don't lose it? And do you come from rich families? Which made us very uncomfortable, to say the least. So we just said we didn't know and tried to change the subject. He also ordered us to never speak Spanish, our mother tongue, whenever we were there, even if we were alone, inside or outside the house, which obviously we didn't do because, well, we speak Spanish. It's not like we have trouble speaking English or anything, but it was just ridiculous when we were literally talking alone. But whenever he would hear us talking in Spanish in our room, which I still don't know how he did, he'd come up and scold us for not conversing in English. Yes, he actually scolded us for not speaking in English. We also later learned too that his wife suffered from a disease. I'm not going to go into detail about that for privacy reasons, but we didn't see her around much, which might explain it. But that night, my friend took a shower first, then me, and whilst I was getting dressed in the bathroom, he came into our rooms and started talking to us and asking us other questions about us. It was really uncomfortable too because, well, like I said, I was still in the bathroom and he kept coming near the door to ask me stuff and then turning back to talk to my friend. But after a while, he left, thankfully, and it was fine. But it was at this stage that we discussed that it was really weird and we were really worried about the money questions because it was his own house and he could easily just come in the room in the middle of the night, open our suitcases and do whatever he wanted. So, the next morning we got up really early and came down for breakfast. To be honest too, I think we kind of had high expectations because of our last host and how they were just the absolute best. So, we were expecting that he would, at the very least, have a slice of bread for us or something. And yeah, he didn't. But that's not the bad part too. You see, whilst the whole family was eating at the table, he told us to go up and go through all the cabinets in the pantry, that there would surely be something to eat there. I honestly didn't feel comfortable with raiding through his family's kitchen while they were there just staring at me. My friend grabbed a banana at some stage because she didn't know what to do, and I said that I wasn't hungry, so in the end we just left and decided to no longer have breakfast at their house because it was just too awkward. And I know you must be thinking that I'm overreacting, but first of all, I didn't know these people, and it was so uncomfortable. Besides, my social anxiety, that didn't help at all too, and I just couldn't bear being there anymore. As I said though, since we had dinner at school, we didn't really spend a lot of time with them, so we really only showered there and slept there, and that was pretty much it. But somehow, in the little time that we were at that house, he always found a way to make us feel more and more out of place. Like, we had to let him know via text when we were coming home, and I'd always be polite, but also friendly, so I would just say, "Hi John, we're 5 minutes away." Always with a little exclamation mark to seem nice, I guess. But the second night we arrived home, and as we went through the front door, he came stomping his way towards us, absolutely furious, like he was about to punch a wall, and he started yelling at me, telling me to never ever text him or any adult like that again. I was so incredibly confused and scared, like, what did I even send him? He pulled out his phone and made me read out loud that message. He said normal people do not text like that it was very disrespectful, and proceeded to show the text to everyone around the house and asking them what they thought of this, and if anyone had ever texted them like this, and he was so angry about an exclamation mark. I was living inside, absolutely at the verge of tears and at the point of leaving the house. And in the end, I just said sorry and went to our room. He then came up smiling like nothing had happened and had the absolute audacity to ask, "Have you brought any gifts for us?" We had, mind you, we had brought them a beautiful picture frame and lots of sweets from our country. We had spent a lot of money on them too, and we handed it out to them. He was acting like a little kid at Christmas, but when he opened them, he looked at them like we had given him a bag of trash. "This is it?" he asked, frowning. "I thought it was going to be something better. I figured, since we're letting you stay in our home. But I guess it's fine. Thanks." And then he left the room disappointed. We continued to have really, really bad encounters with him, telling us off like we were his daughters that he could yell at like it was nothing. At night, we'd hear screaming, fighting, banging and crying, and my friend wanted to contact accommodation services to ask for a host switch because we were truly having a really horrible time at this point, running away from our host to avoid another interaction, but I refused to. I know, pretty dumb. Because, firstly, I was too shy and scared of what could happen when we told him that we were leaving for another home, and also, I felt really, really bad because of his wife. And I didn't want to give the family a hard time when they were probably already struggling with medical care and hosting was their only income. She was mad at him for a bit, but she thought the same as I did. As badly as we wanted to leave, we didn't think that it was right, so we decided to just suck it up, get it over with, and be on our way. We also had gotten lost at some point while we were on the night bus back home at one point. Luckily, there was a teacher from the school who we knew, and she walked us home. And she asked who we were staying with, and we told her that we were staying with John, and mentioned that it was a bit uncomfortable there. And her face changed a little bit from happy to kind of worried. "Yeah, I know him. We've been told that he's a bit special, but that's it really. I wouldn't worry about it too much, but just be careful, okay? Yeah, try to spend a night in that madhouse and you might come up with a different opinion." Anyway, when we told John about us getting lost and the teacher helping us, he seemed so interested in a sort of creepy way. He said that he knew her too and asked us how she was. And the creepiest part was that he asked us if we knew where she lived, like at least 2 or 3 times as well. We had seen her house, but we decided to tell him no because it was super weird. The last full day there too, he had told us that he probably wouldn't be home when we arrived, since he mentioned that he was meeting a friend or something, but that he would arrive no longer than 10 minutes after we did. We arrived home that night, and as he'd said, he wasn't home. This time, the only one home was his wife, and it was our first time getting to chat with her only. She was surprisingly nice too. She seemed genuinely like the only sane person in this house, and we talked for a while, actually, and then we thanked her profusely for everything, even though her husband is our nightmare, and told her that she had a very beautiful family. Then she stopped smiling and said, "You think so? I don't think so," and laughed. "But thank you." And then it was just this awkward sort of silence for a moment. For about 30 seconds, I think, in fact. Neither of us knew what to say to respond to that, so after a bit we just sort of nervously laughed and said goodnight and went to bed. John didn't return until almost midnight that night. He asked us if we had any laundry to do. I did. Some of the clothes I'd been wearing for a week and really needed to be washed. But then he said that he would do it and wouldn't let me go and help or do it myself. And honestly, this might be a stretch, but I really didn't want to give him my clothes for some reason. It just felt wrong. So I ended up declining, saying that I remembered that I actually had washed them, which I knew it wasn't believable, but there was no way that I was about to give him my stuff. He kept insisting, asking over and over again if I was sure, and I said that I was. The next morning, we were really excited to finally be able to leave that house after a week that felt honestly like a month. We had our things ready, and we took our stuff down the stairs to the main entrance, waiting for the cab to pick us up. Then he came downstairs and started to sort of make small talk with us. He kept looking at the window over and over again, like he was looking for something. We thanked him for the hospitality, which wasn't provided, but you gotta be polite, I guess. And he started rambling about how he loved hosting students, that he'd been doing this for like 10 years and stuff like that. And then he started saying weird stuff like, but you have to be careful because you don't know who you could be staying with. There's some crazy people out there, you know. And I swear to you that I was about to escape, getting ready to run, and then the cab arrived, finally. And he started suddenly acting super nice and happy, like we had the greatest relationship. He hugged my friend, and then he went to hug me. I sort of reluctantly hugged him back for a second, and then we went out the door. As soon as I stepped out of that house, he slammed the door shut so loudly, even the cab driver looked scared. He glared at us through the little window while we got in the cab and drove off, and I've never been so relieved in my life to leave a place. It was honestly like a huge weight being pulled off my shoulders. And you can bet that I blocked that number so quickly, glad that I would never have to see them again in my life. Now, I understand that families have their issues, but that man was absolutely terrifying. Even though I'm really thankful that I had at least a place to shower and sleep for a week, I'm sorry for anyone that has had to stay with him in over these 10 years of hosting, or may have to stay with him in the future. I guess the moral of the story is, don't be like me. If you feel uncomfortable, then you should leave. No one's going to be mad at you. I guess that I'm lucky that nothing more than the overall weirdness and verbal abuse happened to me, but there's tons of cases in which these stories take a much darker turn. And it is truly better to be safe than sorry. So this is a bit of a weird one. Years ago, I worked in a supermarket in a small town. It was a pretty hellish place to work, so many of the employees banded together and were really friendly with each other. One of my co-workers, Ben, wasn't the kind of guy that I would usually be friends with, but he was pretty funny in a kind of quirky, offbeat kind of way, and he helped make the day go faster, so it was good. He and I were still friendly with each other, and when I left for an office job, he hugged me goodbye on my last day. Cut to several years later, one of mine and Ben's mutual friends posted an article on Facebook and said, "I can't believe I used to be friends with this piece of shit." I read the article and my stomach just turned cold. It was a news story about how Ben had gone to prison for aggressively murdering his infant son and then tried to cover up what he had done. I was pretty disturbed and couldn't believe that I had once been friendly with someone who could do such a thing. Even more years passed and I moved to a different county and a different job. I now work in an office that has a warehouse attached. I work in the office, but the warehouse has a really high turnover. People leave or are fired, get hired all the time. And one day I hear the office door open and the guy says that he's come to start working in the warehouse. It's the first day, and I look over my shoulder. To my horror, I realize this guy could be Ben. He looks older and rougher than the last time that I saw him, but it could definitely be him. I ask for the new guy's name, and yep, it's Ben. I didn't want to spread gossip or start a panic or anything, but I felt that I had to say something. Many of the office employees bring their children to work some days, and even though I doubt Ben is now in the business of just killing random children, how do I know what he is or isn't capable of? I spoke to the warehouse manager, who was horrified to learn the truth. I showed him the article about what Ben had done, and the warehouse manager told me that Ben had lied in his application and said that he had no criminal convictions. He was fired immediately and was escorted out of the office.
Are you ready to get demonic? Today's episode features allegedly true stories about encounters with demons. Those things that can haunt your home, your life, and even the woods. So bury your inner demons for a while, ain't no one got time for that, and let's enjoy these creepy stories. If you have a scary story of your own and want me to narrate it, share it with me at darkstories.org. Also, check out eeriecast.com for more terrifying podcasts like this. Now, let's begin. Superstition or reality? From Returner 0173. I'd recently turned 28 years old and felt a sudden urge to look back on my life. There are people, friends, and teachers I wanted to see again. At least, it felt like that. But oddly enough, I don't remember their full names or their faces. Instead, I decided to look up family I hadn't seen in a long time, since immigrating to the United States. That's when I started to feel unease, as certain memories flooded back. My dad's family immigrated to the US a long time ago, which leaves my mother's side back in the Philippines. When I was younger, I would visit them during times when school was out of session. They live on the northern part of the archipelago, in a very rural area called Agoo La Union. The area is surrounded by rice paddies and tree lines that housed fish ponds that also transitioned to more rice paddies, and the home itself is 2 hours away by foot from the beach if you cut through the rice paddies. The exact memories causing me unease occurred during the only and last full year I'd spent there. It was right before our family immigrated to the US. Due to how the school system worked, despite having completed more advanced subjects, the K-12 system in the US would force me a year back. So the family decided I would go ahead and spend a full year with my mother's family in La Union, while they finalized the paperwork and while my mother settled things with her company. All my other visits prior to this had been great. The Spanish colonial style of home was made almost entirely out of some red-colored hardwood, and the furniture looked as though it had been made specifically to match the house. It felt scenic and more relaxing than the modern city life I'd been accustomed to. That made me curious. However, my grandparents and the family that lived there had one rule. Do not try to open a specific room on the second floor, and if you somehow find it open, do not remove the cover of the mirror inside. I never questioned this rule before, but this time around I had a full year, and I was 10 years old. I spent about 6 months, curious but no unusual goings-on. When I would pass that room, I would end up staring at the door. I'd ask my grandparents about it, but they'd just smile at me and tell me to ignore it. My grandparents are a mix of Spanish, Japanese, and Filipino. I shrugged the rules off as just superstition. The rest of the family told me to ignore it as well, but emphasized to avoid the room. 3 months before our flight to the United States, things would begin to change. One July afternoon, I had spent the day with the local kids climbing trees and getting bit by large red ants while trying to get at the sweet fruits called duat, or Java plums, since everyone else was away doing errands and business. I believe it was around 4 p.m., or maybe 5 p.m., that I went back to the house as my grandparents and cousins were coming home. I ran upstairs to grab a change of clothes and a towel, since I spent most of the day sweaty and dirty. I turned right at the top of the stairs to go to this open area. It's kind of like another living room. There are sofas lining the 3 walls, and the windows right by them were open. I don't remember opening them myself before I left the house to play. There were 2 doors in there too. If you continue straight from the doorway after turning right from the top of the stairs, those doors would be to your left. The farthest door from the stairs is a room where I kept my clothes. The closer door to the stairs is the one we're supposed to keep locked. Well, when I went through the doorway, that door was wide open. It was the smallest room I've ever seen. It's almost like a closet, maybe slightly wider to fit a twin XL bed on the left side, but there wasn't anything in that room except at the very back was a mirror. I'm 5'11" right now, and that thing would have been at least 6'4", with the wooden frame and all. The mirror itself was shaped like an oval, but at this moment I didn't know that because there was a thick white cloth covering the whole thing. I felt drawn to it, but I remembered that I was not supposed to go in there. The longer I stared, the more unease I felt. I told myself to see if there was anyone else home, but my body wouldn't move. I was standing a few feet away from the entrance of that room, but my mind was racing. I knew I hadn't seen anyone on my way to the house and on my way up. I had to be alone. The more I realized this, the more the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I felt something grab onto my arm. I yelled, freaking out. But it was my grandmother, looking at me scared and worried. I think I may have seen some anger in her expression too. She moved her body so that the view of the mirror was obscured, and she asked me in a very stern voice, "Did you look into the mirror?" I looked around a bit confused. It was already dark out, but I had only come up here a few minutes ago, when there was still light out. I told her I don't know, that I had just got back in from playing outside. As she escorted me downstairs, she apologized that they came home a bit late because the place that hulls the rice we harvest had a problem. When I looked at the clock downstairs, it was nearly 8 p.m. Where had the time gone? I think she may have told my grandfather and my cousins because they all went up together while I was eating dinner. I didn't do anything after that as I was still confused. By the time I went to bed, it was around 12 p.m. When I went back upstairs, that door was closed again. They'd attached something by the doorknob, and a chain was looped through it. This was to prevent the door from swinging inward and opening. That confused me even more, since that still meant someone from the outside could just undo the chains if they wanted to. But I guess they didn't think I was the one who opened the door in the first place. Aside from my grandparents' room and the room I keep my clothes in, which only had one bed for my female cousin, the rest of us slept on bamboo mats with a futon on top that we roll out on the floor of the living room-like area upstairs. There are 4 of us, ranging from 10 to 15 years old, and I was the youngest. My mind was occupied that night, and unable to sleep until sunrise, I only slept like an hour or 2 at that point before my cousins woke me up for good. But nothing creepy had occurred. For an entire week, it was peaceful, and I'd forgotten all about it. Then things picked up. Exactly a week later, during an event just after dinner, we were watching a show while relaxing, and I had to use the bathroom. The problem was that the house itself had no bathroom built in it. The house had a gazebo or an extended roof to the side. In a way, the front door is a side door, since the front that faces the gate and the road to enter the property has no door, just windows. Once you exit the front door, you turn left for a few feet, and right next to the house is a cemented staircase leading up to a door. This is where the toilet was. The height is about midway between the second and first floor. It's like walking up to a throne, which I always enjoyed as a kid. Above the toilet on the wall is a rectangular hole that opens to the backyard, where there was a large mango tree. Beyond that, it opens to a field of rice paddies. While I was on the toilet, I felt a chill. There was something primal inside me that made me sweat, despite the night being cold. That feeling of being watched coming from all over was prickling at my senses. I knew there was no way this was possible, as there's only one opening and it was right above me. I tried my best to act like nothing was happening, telling myself not to turn around or look up. I sat there, my nerves causing my body to shiver. I heard a sound that forced me to bite my lip until it bled, to stop myself from screaming. This sound was unmistakably like someone's tongue clicking, and it sounded deliberate. Each sound clicked in threes, separated by 2 seconds apart, and they grew harder each time. I was trying to finish as fast as I could, pushing the bidet multiple times. When I was finally completely done, I ran out as fast as I could. I'd forgotten to pull my pants up too. It was a miracle I didn't trip. My eldest male cousin, Eugene, looked at me worried. Everyone had gone up to bed while I was in the toilet. Apparently, I'd been taking too long. He was asked to wait for me downstairs. I couldn't explain it to him, but it must have spooked him, because he looked out the windows before shutting them. The windows there were made of small rectangular sheets that are lined up horizontally, like those horizontal blinds, and they close much in the same way. He urged me upstairs after shutting them, and did the same to the windows up there before we lay down to sleep. I don't know what time it was, but it was extremely dark. I woke up from this sound, like creaking. I was the second to the last spot closest to the doorway that leads to the stairs. Eugene was the last. I could tell the creaking was coming from the door, because in the entire darkness a light was coming off from there, and it grew more and more before the creaking transitioned to the floorboards. I felt a pinch on my arm then. It was Eugene facing me. I could barely see his face in the dark, but the moonlight coming through the now opened room made some of his features more visible. He looked afraid. His head shook side to side as though telling me not to look. He didn't speak, but the finger on his lips told me not to make a sound. He closed his eyes for several seconds, then opened them, telling me to do the same by nodding. No words were exchanged, but the way his eyes widened when the creak of the floorboards sounded louder and closer made it obvious. I began to sweat, my chest heaving, but I forced myself not to make a sound, and I closed my eyes tightly. The creak continued moving around the room. Eugene held my arm tightly to make sure I was still there, since he had closed his eyes as well. I kept mine closed, but the anxiety of hearing the creaking sounds moving closer made me tense up. My eyelids were beginning to hurt. I do not know how long it took. It felt eternal. There were no footsteps on the floors each time it creaked, but sometime later, clear taps, almost like a footstep but distorted, came from the ceiling, replacing the creaking on the floorboard. A loud metallic creak filled the room coming from the farthest wall. My eyes were closed, but my back was pointing against the source of the metallic creak. The cool breeze let me know that the window had been opened. The taps on the ceiling were right above me. Eugene's hand tightened even more, and I got a feeling that my other cousins were also awake now. They were normally messy sleepers, but they were dead steady. The footsteps on the ceiling stopped right above me, but I could feel that if I opened my eyes, something would be staring right at me, and it made me want to scream. I could feel the breeze from the now open window against my back, and there was a cold brush against my cheek. Then the tongue clicks returned, and they were loud, as though whoever or whatever was making them knew we were awake. It came from behind me, and the sound of something hollow tapping on the glass pane came too. As I mentioned, the walls were lined with the sofa, so right by our head a sofa separated us from the wall. The two windows lining that wall right above us creaked. The smell of tobacco hit my nose, followed by sulfur and ammonia. From that same window, I could hear heavy breathing each time the tobacco smell surged. The leaves of the mango tree by that window shook like something was moving the branches. The tongue clicks behind me, the tobacco, ammonia, sulfur smells, and heavy breathing right by my head seemed to go on forever. I was not in the right mind to keep track of time, but I know for sure that it would be a while before the floorboard creaked again. I heard cackling from both directions out the window, then felt an unmistakable cold hand grasping my right ankle. Eugene squeezed my arm then. I guess he could feel me become more tense, and I tried to remain calm, but I soiled myself then. After that, I'm not sure what happened. I know that I spent the entire night awake. When the neighbor's chickens crowed, Eugene sat up, followed by the rest of my cousins. They were all drenched in sweat, and so was I. Being boys, they would have surely made fun of me for soiling myself, but they didn't. It was still just before sunrise, but there was enough light for us to move around now. We turned on the lights and ran downstairs as a group, all scared but relieved. The locked room was wide open, and the mirror had no covers on it. When I came around to look sometime later that day, the window panes had scratch marks that weren't there before. The ceiling had scratch marks on it too. My uncle and Eugene were trying to fix the door. Apparently the knob had been completely wrecked, so I was able to see inside while they were trying to fix it. The floor by the mirror, when I first looked in the room, there weren't any scratch marks, but now that floor was covered in them. This experience would continue on, differing intensity for the rest of the time I was there, especially the feeling of being watched. It stopped feeling like that for a long while since moving to the US, until I remembered it all recently. Since then, I feel creeped out at night, especially when there's a large mirror and an opened window. But it's summer here now, and it feels extremely hot. Now and again, dreams that feel too real about something coming out of a mirror when I'm alone plagues me. I don't know anymore. Is it just suggestive superstition, or was it all real? "9 months of torment." From Anonymous. Let me begin by saying it's out of my element to write about personal experiences of any kind. I tend to avoid thinking about them for the most part. Now, I grew up hearing voices, seeing or being followed by things that I couldn't put into words, and so as I got older, I would self-medicate with certain substances, as one tends to do when they don't want to face their reality. I say this because it all ties together for this story. I've made many mistakes and I've paid dearly for them. One of these grave errors led to me being sentenced to a federal prison. If you saw me in person, you'd never think of me as a felon or criminal, but many people that find themselves in a similar position rarely look like what you think they would. I went to a federal women's prison camp in Kentucky, which was adjacent to a high-security men's prison. When you think of prison, you think of cell blocks and barred doors, but in reality, a camp offers you a lot more freedom. We weren't behind a barbed wire fence or barred doors that automatically close you in. There were communal bathrooms, and for the most part, you had free range of the camp, although there were set hours you had to be in your room for counts, etc. A count is when a guard goes through the entire facility and counts you, so they can make sure there are no inmates escaping, missing, out of bounds, etc. I came in during the height of the Rona, so a lot of the programs were shut down, and there wasn't much to do but sleep and hope for a good work assignment, which would help you pass the time. My first experience wasn't as horrifying as my others, but it was still very unsettling. At the time, I was of course on edge. I was entering a prison with other women, forced to live in a tiny room with 12 other people that you don't know, and who was to say what they were there for or what they were capable of to begin with? I was sleeping on the top bunk, which was next to the wall, with my back facing the room. One night, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I assumed it was someone asking me something, or trying to offer me something, as some people there would offer to try to peddle smuggled cigarettes or pills in exchange for commissary items. So I pretended to be asleep and ignored it. Something tapped me again. I groaned and turned around, waiting for my eyes to adjust, but no one was there. I swung my head down to look below at the inmate sleeping under me, expecting to find them giggling and being childish. I assumed someone was trying to haze me, as I was the new inmate in the room. But she was sleeping softly, snoring along with everyone else in the room. As you can imagine, it's not a quiet place, even in the middle of the night, with everyone sleeping around you. I turned back over, trying to fall asleep. Right as I felt myself fading out of consciousness, something which felt very much like a hand forcefully placed its palm on my shoulder instead of the light taps I felt before. This jolted me awake, and I turned to nothing again. After that, I never slept with my back facing the room again. It was always strategically placed against the wall, so I wouldn't be tapped or grabbed anymore. Now, although there was access to substances at this facility, I was sober and very clear-minded. I'd finally made the decision to get my life together, but I'd almost forgotten what sobriety also brought back into my life. After gaining some bearings and observing my fellow inmates, I felt comfortable enough to ask someone what they may have experienced in this facility. I was told the camp used to be an old drug farm back in the 1920s, where people that maybe smoked up a little would be admitted involuntarily and subjected to torture-like experiments, such as getting them addicted to other substances and then taking it away to see how they would react. Many people died, and the basement of the facility, which now housed the gym and the library, used to be the morgue. My next experience was a shared one. I was growing restless, and with my newfound sobriety, I wanted to get healthier in different ways. I wanted to start going to the gym. I found someone closer in age to me, and we started to work out together. The basement was sort of separated in different wings with the main common area for the library. Pretty much anywhere you went, you could find a group of inmates playing cards somewhere. There was a group in the common area, and the gym was down the wing. We would close the doors to the hallway as the women playing cards were usually loud and excited about spades or rummy or whatever they may have been playing. Another girl and I were lying on the floor on a yoga mat, waiting for our next set to begin, when the lights started to flicker on and off. This was an old building. When lights flicker, I don't assume it's something supernatural or paranormal. I assume the place is falling apart, and they refuse to fix anything, so we ignore it. We keep working out. Then again, the lights flicker while we're resting in between sets. We certainly heard a D-man's cackle. It sounded sinister, and the lights went completely dark while we were lying on our backs on the floor. It was so dark, in fact, you couldn't see 2 inches in front of your face. That's when we began to get scared. We froze there for a moment, not saying anything because we both didn't want to acknowledge the man's voice. There were guards in the facility, male guards as well as female, but they were serious and not to be spoken to or messed with. They wouldn't play pranks on inmates. The lights finally came back on after what felt like hours, but it was probably only about 2 minutes, and we ran out of the gym then into the common area where the women were still playing cards, like nothing creepy had just happened. We asked them if they flickered the lights on and off, or if they lost power in this room too, but they just looked at us confused, slightly annoyed too that we were interrupting their game. Time passed and more small incidents kept occurring, but it almost reminded me of my childhood, how I just kind of had to get used to it. One night I woke up having to go to the bathroom. It was probably close to 3 a.m. I got my toilet paper and walked to the communal bathrooms, which had some stall doors on them. Some only had shower curtains to block them. Some stalls had nothing, and people used them anyways. Prison takes away lots of things, but one of the most treasured that you don't even think about would be privacy. While I'm using the restroom, I hear footsteps enter the bathroom, and the rustle of the shower curtain being moved. I'm not concerned at this point, more so curious, because it's rare for people to be up and moving around at this time, especially so close to count. But I just assumed they have to use the bathroom just like me. My curiosity led me to bend down to peek at the feet of my neighbor. But when I do, I see almost blackened feet, crusted with a dark brown, gooey substance that looks like blood. The toenails were cracked and bleeding. The heels were scarred and hardened. This was not normal. It was common sense to make sure no matter where you go within the prison, you wear shoes, as you could get athlete's foot, especially in the bathrooms. And even so, why did this person's feet look like this? They must have been in agony. It took me a minute to register what I was seeing. I looked up, kind of confused. Then this deep sense of dread washed over me, and I felt extremely heavy. I looked back again, at my neighbor's feet, but I didn't see anything. No one was there anymore. I quickly ran back to my room, silently praying the thing with the mangled and bloody feet did not follow me into my cell. Things kept happening to other women. You would hear the stories that were passed down to one inmate to another, which were always embellished, and you could tell when someone was adding something or flat out lying, just to tell a story, as a woman's prison is a very gossipy place, for the most part. I met this one girl who was fairly new. She had been designated in this area known as the bus stop to sleep and essentially live with about 40 other women in a common area on the other side of the camp. She looked ragged, like she hadn't slept in years, but she was so young. She told me one day that every time she fell asleep, she felt something hold her down by the throat, and it wouldn't let go. That's why she never slept. Although this isn't part of my story, I could tell something was tormenting her. She looked broken. Someone so young. Obviously, she had made a mistake or two to be here, but still she had a life left to live and a chance to change. But she looked just absolutely broken. After some time at this facility, I got a good work assignment that allowed me to be moved to a more private 2-man cell that was very coveted but only available for early morning outdoor workers. I was happy to gain more privacy and only have to deal with one other inmate as a roommate at the time. She was an older woman that, from what I understood, had been sentenced to prison for murder for hire as she tried to hire someone to get rid of her abusive husband. She was kind, but a little odd. She, for the most part, could be found playing cards with her group of friends. At one point, she got the Rona and had to be moved to a different wing to quarantine. Now, it sounds horrible, but I was so excited to have a room to myself for 2 weeks. She was in good health and not in any danger of getting sicker, but the idea of just being able to change freely and sleep without being awakened by someone else was awesome. This sliver of freedom made me feel so happy, but I probably slept 6 hours total in those 2 weeks. Anytime I tried to sleep, my bed would start to vibrate. The entire bed just shook uncontrollably. It was so scary because it wouldn't stop even after I woke up. I would see shadow figures on the wall from the hallway. I felt like I was constantly being watched, and I just couldn't fall asleep for fear of being shaken awake. Towards the end of my sentence, I had been there for about 8 months, and I was due to be released in a month for good behavior. I had a light sentence and was feeling very excited for my newfound sobriety and fresh start once I got home. I had a dream. I've always had dreams that one could say are almost like a fever dream, and somehow end up coming to fruition, or like a feeling of déjà vu for me. In this case, I had a dream that I was home, the best kind of dream. I was home and I was sleeping in my big comfy bed when I heard a gunshot. I woke up in the dream and I looked around. My partner, who I was still with while imprisoned, was gone from my side. I went frantic in the dream, looking all over the house for him and then the garage. When I got to the garage, I saw a body lying in a puddle of blood, but it was behind the car, so I couldn't see anything but the knees down. I woke up in real life, crying uncontrollably, which is not common for me as being in prison kind of made me very unemotional. I didn't feel comfortable crying or showing any sort of weakness there. But I couldn't stop. I was horrified. I had to call my significant other. I had this horrible feeling in my gut that something bad happened. We have specific phone times. We can only use the phone within our specific wings or blocks time, because of Rona mostly. But it wasn't yet our time to use the phone. I begged one of the counselors to use the phone, and for the most part they would normally say no, but I think he could see something was wrong in my eyes. He could tell I needed to use the phone, and he allowed me to. I quickly called and confirmed my partner's safety. I promised I'd call later during my phone times, and just hearing their voice and knowing they were okay was all I needed. I went to talk to a group of girls that I had befriended during my stay, to just get this off my chest and move on with the day. One of the girls that I was friends with was in the office, which is usually serious. We found out it was a family emergency, so we waited for her to come back, then we could be supportive. Nothing is worse than seeing someone lose a family member in prison, not being able to be there for them. I've seen women lose children, and the wailing cries and screams you can hear throughout the camp is one of the worst sounds I will ever hear in my life. We were waiting for this friend when she comes out and just bursts into tears. She said her brother had shot himself in his garage. When I eventually told the women about my dream, they turned and looked at me, shocked. Apparently, what I had just described to them was apparently what had happened. We all went into overdrive, trying to comfort our friend while thinking about the dream at the same time. Prisons have a lot of history, and I think it's safe to assume there's something nefarious going on in most of them beyond the realm of the living. I've been out for over a year now, and my life is completely turned around. I'm sober, and occasionally I have instances where the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I take it as a warning, and I follow my instincts instead of trying to drown them in substances now. Although all of these experiences were horrifying, I didn't feel like I was ever in grave danger. For the most part, it felt like something or someone wanted to be heard or acknowledged, but there was something else there that was more malevolent, something that seemed to feed off the sorrow and pain of the inmates, something lurking and watching, always watching. Demonic Lady, from Rosie Gone Rosie. I was around 8 years old when this happened. I had been living temporarily with my aunt, uncle, and their children, or my cousins, at the time, for reasons I will not go into. I remembered I'd been sitting on the bottom bunk. I was reading one of my favorite books at the time. I never really felt comfortable being in a room by myself when I was younger. I always felt there were these presences in the same room as me. My parents had always chalked it up to me being clingy or having a bad dream. But on this occasion, the air went still, and I had this weird feeling that something or someone was watching me. So I shut the book and looked up. My heart began to pound like a drum when I saw who had been watching me. It wasn't a who, though. It was more like a what. A demon-like pale white figure was staring at me from the top bunk. Chills filled my body, and I was paralyzed with fear. I shivered, not from being cold. It was from the huge amount of fear I was feeling at the moment. This woman had pale white skin that was the color of fresh snow. She had raven black hair, and her entire eye was black, like a demon's from one of those supernatural TV shows. She opened her mouth wide and showed off her sharp teeth, which resembled what a carnivore's teeth would look like. Our staring contest we had seemed to go on for a minute or two before the demonic-like creature began to speak.
Do you want to play a game?
The creature asked in a distorted voice. I shook my head, terrified. The creature growled, and it seemed to lunge at me. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, that demonic woman, more like creature, had vanished into seemingly thin air. It should be impossible that someone or something could just disappear that quickly. I shoved my book to the side and raced out of the room. I told my cousins and siblings what I witnessed. They assumed it was just my overactive imagination. I'm 18 years old now, and I still think about it every now and then. I tried to research what the creature was, but I had little to no success. Hopefully it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Whatever it was, I certainly don't want another encounter with whatever the heck it was. If it hadn't disappeared, well, it would have eaten me, I guess. And that makes me feel rather unnerved. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.